Welcome to the Trail Chasers podcast. I'm your host, Dean Horwitz, and I'm excited to share this journey with you. Each week, we'll be hitting the trails with some of South Africa's most inspiring trail runners, diving into the topics that matter most and uncovering the secrets of this incredible sport. Lace up your trail shoes and join me on this adventure. New episodes every week. How's it, Spurge? Welcome to the Trail Chasers podcast. I've been trying to get you on here for a while. This podcast is a lot about the stories around trail running and the characters that make up the South African trail running scene. You're a key cog in that. So thank you for making time. I'm very excited to dive into everything. In terms of what you do on a day-to-day, has it always been the dream to be a farmer?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me, and sorry it's taken so long to pin me down. And those who know me will know I'm a bit gun-shy of these kind of things, so at least we got here eventually. On the farming side, I grew up on the farm and have always lived there and wanted to live. Underberg is obviously a beautiful part of the world and very fortunate to live in a place like that, so it doesn't take much effort to want to stay there. Currently a dairy farmer and beef farmer, and yeah, I have been for a while. I've been back on the farm for sort of 25 years, so just slowly been developing it. It was a very undeveloped farm that had been leased out. So it's been 20 years of building infrastructure and building capacity and all that side of things. So it's a work in progress very much.
How does your year look? Do you have times that you're busy on the farm and times that you're busy with trail running, or is it all encompassing on every front?
Now, there are definitely busier times on the farm. The different seasons are much more hands-on, and there are other times when you can focus on other things and hopefully the system keeps functioning. But certainly, yeah, there are real peak periods where it's full on, and I've tried where possible to dovetail like the trail running side of things and that side of the busy times on the farm, but it's not always possible. So of like for UTD, there's a very busy time on the farm. So it is what it is. So you've just got to make things happen to the best of your ability. But it's, obviously trail running's often very seasonally determined. Especially in a place like Underberg, you just can't have big extreme events in the berg sort of in full summer with lightning and storms and flash flooding, all sorts of things. And then obviously the peak of winter is probably too cold and there's the risk of felt fires and stuff like that. You know, you are limited in what you can do. So sometimes that comes into conflict with what's happening on the farm, but it is what it is here.
How do you manage balancing those challenges? And I heard a story about a storm during the Sani Stagger, and you also like running the event and like trying to manage the farm. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, anyone who knows anything about farming knows it's mainly often just crisis management and fixing broken things. Like whenever I go away from the farm, whoever's staying at home always says everything went wrong while you were away. And my response is always, no, that's just normal. You just don't see it. Yeah, things like that. It's just, you just got to get on top of it. Yeah, that's as an example, Sani Stagger is fairly risky in its timing of the year, but that's its traditional date that I inherited when I took over the events 9-10 years ago. That's mid-November. You can get some early berg storms coming through and stuff like that. And that's what happened last year. Just flattened everything at Stagger, at the race venue. And then, we had chaos on the farm with trees down and everything else. But just one of those days.
You're in a unique situation where it's like anything that will affect the races affects you too, because the farm's in the same area as the races.
Yeah, sometimes you're pulling in the same direction for the race and the farm, and sometimes it's the opposite. So like for UCD in late April, we often hoping for some really good last moisture for the summer, whereas you obviously don't want that to arrive on race weekend. So you're hoping that like maybe 3 or 4 days before UCD, you get some really good rain for the farm, and then things clear up for the race itself. So sometimes they're in conflict as well.
You mentioned to me that you've been in the trail running event space for 15 years. Well, what inspired the start of your Running Man Adventure company, and how has it evolved over the last 15 years?
I've always been quite heavily involved in sport from back in the school days, and then in my 20s, I did a lot of triathlon, things like that. And then obviously living where I do, it's just so easy to get outside and go for a mountain bike ride or go for a run. So always heavily involved, and There was a local mountain biking club that we were all quite heavily involved in when mountain biking was really taking off in, the early 2000s. And inevitably every club in the country, I'm sure, started putting on their own little race and stuff like that. So we got involved in that kind of stuff, just more as a community, organizing mountain biking races around Underberg, building trails. And then obviously trail running was, 5-10 years behind the mountain biking boom. Once trail running really started to take off, I was always more interested in the running side than the riding side. So that was just a natural fit. And also, as we all know, trail running is such low maintenance. You put your shoe on and you're out the back door. It's just so easy. So I think as life got busier with farming and kids and everything else, it was just much easier just to focus on the running side of things rather than worrying about bike maintenance and punctures and equipment and everything else that goes with bikes. Yeah, the mountain biking started to take a back seat, and so did the triathlon as well, just from a personal perspective. And yeah, it was sort of transitioned from club races and just fun community events into my own personal running man adventures, putting on formal events about 11 years ago.
Sure. And obviously you're very much about the environment, obviously being a farmer as well. So how do you ensure, and obviously also living in the area, you want to obviously leave the area like as good as you found it. So how do you ensure that you do leave that positive impact on the environment?
We've always been very environmentally aware, just living where we do. I grew up fly fishing and bird watching and doing all things like that, and just appreciating the natural environments around us, because it is such a unique and beautiful environment. It's not a difficult sort of step to then incorporate that into the trail running and all the events that we do, especially when the events are actually not just on the farm, but obviously up in the World Heritage Sites in the berg of the environment, just staring you in the face at every angle. So you almost feel a responsibility to preserve it, but also to maintain it and just protect it. So it was always a natural fit. Just with Giants Cup, which was obviously the first event that we started, we had to approach Esemvelo because the entire Giants Cup trail is in the World Heritage Site, and Esemvelo, KZN are obviously the custodians of that environment. You can't just pitch up and put on an event. You have to go through all the formal channels. So when we started Giants Cup, we went and met with them, put a whole proposal together. We had an environmental management plan and all the things that go along with things like that if you want to hold them in such a pristine environment. And part of the deal or the arrangement that we made was obviously, besides not impacting on the trail or the environment in any negative way, we also committed to raise a certain portion of each entry fee and donate it to Esemvelo. It was just a very natural, right from the start. That was just the relationship we had. And we never wanted it to be window dressing. We really felt passionate about the whole thing, irrespective of it from a commercial or business point of view. So we were quite generous from our side in terms of what we proposed as a fee per runner and things like that. And for the first few years, I think Esemvelo made a lot more money out of the races than we did. In hindsight, that was a very good move because it established our credibility, showed that we were serious about what we were doing, and that we were willing to put the environment through which we ran ahead of the race, and showed that in the first few years. Obviously, we still do, but we were taking quite a financial pounding, but Esemvelo and that they always got their money. And I think that's such an important thing. The relationship has to be sustainable, and the relationship has to be authentic. I think in those relationships, if they think you're potentially just taking advantage or something like that, it's never going to end well and it's not going to last. So I think we've built good relationships, not just with Esemvelo and the other entities, but the individuals who work for them as well. There's a lot of people at Esemvelo who I've got to know over the years, and in the other NGOs environmentally, and building relationships with all those people is a key part of all the RMA events, and it's served us well.
How do you balance, or what is it like, how do you focus your efforts on creating this sense of community, adventure, and obviously conservation, and trying to balance those elements and ensuring that you're ticking all of those boxes as opposed from just putting on a race and there it's done? Is that a bit of a challenge, and how have you done that?
It's definitely something we focus on, but we are fortunate in that the environments in which the events take place. And I don't just mean the natural environment, in the area of Underberg, the fact that it's a small community, everybody knows everybody, and then also the fact that with many other events that might take place near big cities or things like that, it's harder for them to keep that sense of everybody being together, because obviously they're together on race day on the trail, but it's more difficult for those events to have that feeling of everybody away and in the mountains together. Whereas with UTD and Giants Cup and Sani Steiger, we all are quite isolated. Everybody's staying in B&Bs and little hotels around the area. There's not much else to do in terms of entertainment from a city perspective. People are more likely to come back to the finish line, especially events like UTD where the finish line's open for 45 hours. People are often finish their race and then the next morning come back and have breakfast and a couple of coffees and then watch the runners or the back markers coming in. So we obviously try and foster that and entice people back, but also just where we are, because of the isolation, it does make it a bit easier for us because we're the only show in town.
And what is it about the Underberg that makes it so special to you?
My family's lived there for 100 years, so that's obviously we've got a long connection to the place. And I've also been fortunate to travel a lot, especially when I was younger, and it really is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I can say that, I think, safely without bias. When you drive around the area and you're constantly seeing tourists stopping, taking photographs of something that you look at every day, you realize that this is a special place. And also just things growing up that I did and still do now with my children, things like fly fishing and obviously running in the mountains and hiking and just getting out and about and looking at the wildlife and the birds and everything else. It's just, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
And take me back to the beginning of the Giants Cup. What was the environment, or I guess the scene? What was it like when you started it? And what was the kind of point where you're like, oh, this area, this environment would be perfect for this type of race?
Obviously, getting out into the mountains quite a bit was always something that we did, mainly just to hike and that. The trails aren't actually that runnable in the Berg. You can trot a bit here and there, but the challenge that you faced back then was that the fundamental hiking trail was there and was very good, but it was often covered in a whole summer's worth of grass, and the Ezemvelo uses erosion poles every 10 or 20 meters across the trail. They use those creosote poles to stop, obviously, water erosion. And with constant overgrown grass over the trails and those poles, it's actually very difficult to run on those trails. I never really thought that deeply about trail running events on the Giants Cup, for example, which is the most prominent trail in the area, until probably the early 2010s. And then obviously with seeing trail running taking off all over the country, because just to backtrack, obviously before then it was slightly more mountain biking focused that we were thinking about, and those trails were just not even an option. From an event perspective, the light bulb hadn't quite gone off yet, because they were completely unrideable. Obviously they were built for hikers and they had this grass covering over them and the erosion poles. But then once trail running started to explode, we re-looked at those trails and thought, hang on, we can do something here. These trails are magnificent. It's a magnificent area. They're literally just built for running, except for, as I say, this grass erosion pole challenge. And that was actually, funnily enough, the key make or break thing when we approached Ezemvelo was we have to be able to cut the grass above the trail. If we can't cut the grass, it's simply not viable. You just cannot run in a free-flowing manner like you can in the Cape and that, where obviously the trails are exposed and rockier and you don't have that. And when I put the whole proposal together and we went to Ezemvelo, it was the most nerve-wracking part of the whole conversation in that first proposal was, if we can't cut the grass, this is a non-starter, because people are not going to, they're just not going to be willing to be tripping and stumbling and standing on rocks they can't see. We're all for technical trails, but they must be technical because they're challenging to the runner. They mustn't be booby traps where you can't actually see where you're going and where you're putting your feet. There's a fundamental difference between technical and just unrunnable. And once they gave us the go-ahead, and we were pretty nervous that they were going to tell us that we could cut the grass, but we had to do it by hand. And we nervously said to them, look, we're going to have to use brush cutters, but obviously we'll follow all, the environmental laws and everything else. And I think they saw the added benefit to them, because obviously my partner, the two of us who started Giants Cup together, Matt, who went back to the UK in 2019. So Matt and I started it and started Running Man Adventures together and started the Giants Cup in 2014. Yeah, so the first year, Matt and I, the two of us, cut the whole Giants Cup trail, just the two of us.
Sure.
So it was 62 Ks of grass trail, two guys with backpacks and brush cutters, and it took us about 6 weeks. So, obviously not every day and trying to fit in around other stuff. But yeah, it was a really cool thing to have done, because we saw what the job entailed, and it really committed us to the trail and the event. When you go out there and you run along the trail, you see it in a different way. But when you're literally moving along, it's 1K an hour max cutting grass, you really get a different sense for the whole thing. Yeah, so that was a key part of it. And once we could cut the trail, then it was obvious that this was something very special. The Giants Cup is really an incredible hiking trail as a 5-day hiking trail. So being able to turn it into a 2-day run was very exciting.
So the Giants Cup hiking trail, that's like always existed?
That was built by Ezemvelo, I want to say the late 60s, early 70s, as a hiking trail with huts, four overnight stops along the trail, 5-day hike, four overnight stops. And that's pretty much what it was up until we came along and wanted to do a trail run on it. I think its heyday was probably the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then hiking really did tap off quite a bit in the 2000s, and I think it became less well known. The trail became more overgrown, things like that. Yeah, we were very excited to be able to bring a new elements back to the trail and also raise its profile once again. I think a lot of people have found out about the Giants Cup Trail because of the Giants Cup Trail Run, and obviously because of UTD. I know a lot of runners have come back with their families at different times of the year and have hiked the trail or have hiked sections of the trail, or they just come up on weekends and run a section, and they now know they can go in at a certain place, pay their day fee to Ezemvelo and go for a 20K run. So it's really raised its profile, which has been very rewarding to be part of it.
And when you started the Giants Cup, what was the concept? What was the idea? And how was that first one? What was the first one like?
So I had a different idea with the Giants Cup, in that we couldn't just have a race with 800 people on it. So Ezemvelo wasn't going to let us do that in those early days. They wanted to see what we were all about. And we also wanted it to be, I had this idea of, there were a lot of trail runs out there at that time that were just starting. The early trail running scene was very rough and ready, which was great. I think most of us still love that part of it. But I had this idea, well, why don't we try a smaller, more intimate and slightly more high-end event with regard to what we offer. I just wanted to see if there was a niche there that perhaps we could exploit, where the trail and the running and all that part was still challenging and tough, and you had to do it yourself and no one was going to help you out with it. But could we perhaps really raise the bar as to what we offered off the trail, just to try and find new angle in the event space? So the idea was to provide all accommodation, provide all meals. We were lucky enough to have Salomon as a partner back in the first couple of years, and then we changed over to North Face, who have been with us for 7 or 8 years now. And the North Face has been an incredible partner for us. And obviously what they do is they bring some incredible kit to the race. So we're able to offer hotel accommodation, all meals, and several garments from North Face, from high quality jackets to T-shirts and caps and all sorts of things. So we're trying to just approach it from a slightly different angle. And it was a tough sell in those first couple of years, because I think quite a few trail runners thought, this is a bit fancy for trail running. With regard to Giants Cup, obviously, we weren't trying to change the nature of trail running. We were just trying to offer something that potentially wasn't currently being offered in the trail running space. So that, and we just thought it fitted with what we were able to do with Ezemvelo in terms of numbers. And then also the fact that in those days, we went from hotel to hotel. So there are 3 hotels along the route, or that sort of bookend the route. The Bushman's Neck Hotel at one end, the Sunny Pass Hotel at the other end and the Drac Gardens Hotel in the middle. So the idea was you'd spend the first night at the Sunny Pass Hotel, spend the second night at Drac Gardens Hotel, and then spend the last night at the Bushman's Neck Hotel. So also that sense of a journey and an adventure. So everyone would pack up and we'd bring all their kit round. They just arrive at the finish line, check into their hotel room, and go up, and there was their stuff. The only challenge, of course, was that the hotels weren't that excited about it because they're only getting one night's accommodation, and now if they're going to battle to sell that other night if it's a weekend or something like that. That was a little bit of a challenge. And then also, as much as it was fun being part of that sort of journey each day and arriving in a new place, it was also quite disruptive, both for us as organizers and also for the runners, because they had to pack up every morning, make sure all their stuff was put away. So what we did is, I could have the dates wrong, but I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, we went to Sunny Pass Hotel and said, look, we're just going to base ourselves there. They'd just done a major upgrade of the hotel, which also inspired us to maybe stay there permanently. And we went to them and said, okay, can we do all 3 nights here? And what we'll do is we'll just shuttle the runners back from the finish line back to their room. So all they had to do in the morning was just put their running kit on, head to the start, we'd take them to the start line, and then they'd just be taken back to their room from the finish, and everything was still there. It was just a more chilled environment from that perspective. So that's the model we've settled on for the past 5 years or so. And that's been very successful. The Giants Cup is still a slightly more challenging sell in terms of the package itself, because obviously with so much value in the package, the entry fee is pricier. But we believe the message is definitely getting across, and people are starting to see the value, especially if they do the maths and actually work out, okay, if I just come and run and I still pay for my accommodation elsewhere and I still pay for my meals elsewhere, the weekend ends up costing me almost the same amount. So we're just trying to offer that full package. And also what that does is it keeps the runners all together. They don't fragment from the finish line.
It's quite amazing.
So what we end up having is people becoming genuine friends over the 3 nights that the event takes place, and coming back year after year and building friendships and things like that. So that's pretty cool. And then what we've actually done now with Giants Cup since last year is we got permission to expand it to 200 runners. It was always limited to 100 runners, and we've expanded it to 200 now. And we have offered a run-only option. So if you don't want the accommodation and you don't want the meals, and we offer a limited goodie bag as well. And what that's enabled us to do is to offer a much more affordable entry for those people who are looking for that package. And it's been quite popular, but funnily enough, our entries are currently open and they're going really well. When we expanded to 2, so our limit used to be 100. And we already at this year sitting at about 110. So we're over our limits of previous years. But what's been interesting to see is that I think out of the 110 or 115 entries we've currently got, I think only 15 or 20 are run only. So people are still looking, I think, for that complete package, which is vindication that there's a market out there for that, just looking for a little bit of an extra special experience off the trail. There's something we also did, which I think you might be aware of, is we offered a hiking option within the Giants Cup trail run. And we saw how big the hiking community was. A lot of people, they're quite keen to come out and have a proper challenging hike, but in a supported manner. And that's what the Giants Cup is. So now what we end up having is hikers and runners together. And because it's not about being a competitive race, we time the runners, but it's not really about results or that side of things. And because of that, it's very popular with the hikers as well. So it's still much more popular with the runners, but we have probably 20-30% hikers in the field as well. And I think for them, being exposed to the running side of things, and also runners who potentially have family members who aren't runners but are keen hikers, there's now an option for them to come along and be part of the event. So we see quite a few couples or families where some of the families running and some of the families hiking. And it's quite nice to be able to see them do both, especially for older folk who maybe once were runners and now the knees aren't what they were or something like that. So now they're late 60s and they still want to get out there and they still want to challenge, but they don't necessarily want to run. So that little hiking option has become quite a popular choice as well.
Wow.
So the format's still 2 days. Nothing's changed in that regard. But what we do have is we have the full distance over 2 days, or we have the light distance over 2 days. So the full distance
Okay.
is the entire Giants Cup Trail split over 2 days. So it's basically 32 Ks on day one and 30 Ks on day two. So just over 60 Ks in 2 days. And then the light distance starts basically at halfway of each day. So it's 15. It ends up being 15 Ks on day one and 12 Ks on day two. And that's also proved very popular. Once again, you get couples or families where somebody's the long distance runner and somebody's not, and they're now both able to come and take part with, and each have their own experience. And then also what often happens is we'll get people enter the full distance and they downgrade on the second day and just run the light distance on day two. If they just want to take it easy, or maybe got a bit injured the day before or something. So
Yeah. That's very cool. And the hiking version, is it the same format or is it a different format?
That's exactly so. So the hikers, there's the option to do the full 62 Ks, and we get a lot of guys choosing that, so guys and girls choosing that. The only thing that we do is we start the hikers slightly earlier, so they've got a bit more time. So we start them about an hour and a half ahead of the runners. And that's quite nice as well, in that they get a fresh start. They're not under pressure to keep up. Running field will run through them, so they get quite a bit of company and they see runners coming past. And because it's a small field, it's not an issue of congestion or anything like that. It's quite fun for them after they probably 10 Ks into their hike, and the runners start to appear and come past them for a period of an hour or so. So that's quite a nice sort of element of camaraderie to the event.
And how do you manage like aid stations and cutoffs and things like that with such a varied field?
So because Giants Cup takes place in mid-May, it's, touch wood, a very stable weather window. So from our side, we're not too stressed about cutoffs and that sort of thing. The hikers start early. That first light, they'll start around 6 o'clock. Literally, we get some of the hikers coming in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They have a 9-10 hour day. As long as they're fit enough and happy enough, we want people to be able to take part in Giants Cup without feeling the pressure of their cutoffs. Obviously, there's safety things that we will observe. If weather does change or something like that, then if our hand is forced, so be it. But in terms of official cutoffs, there aren't any at Giants Cup. And also, there are aid stations along the route. So if someone's not feeling great, or they've got to 20 Ks and they just have had enough, they can jump in a vehicle and come round to the finish. So there are those options to out if need be. And then, as I said, there's the option to downgrade on day two. So if they take a 10-hour day on day one on the hike, for instance, they might go, okay, I'm going to downgrade and just do the 12 Ks on the Saturday. The formula has worked, so we've never had an issue where someone was, coming in the dark or anything like that. If it's 32 days, 10 hours, you've got 3 Ks an hour. Even though it's in the Berg and it's some challenging trails, 3 Ks an hour is a very, very moderate hiking speed. So they do have time.
Yeah. And in terms of the competitiveness of it, has it ever had an elite element, or does it have an elite element to it?
In the beginning, it did a little bit. Like, we wanted to get some strong runners to raise the profile just because of the nature of them possibly being well-known runners. And also, I wanted, in the early days, to get a feel of what could be done in terms of time and performance on the trail, because it was essentially a trail that had never been run before in its prepared state, where you could run freely at a top speed. Yeah, we had some really strong runners in the early days. We had Rory Skeffer. We've had a few really top runners. And it was pretty cool because the other runners got to see what was possible with regard to an athlete. There were 3, 4, 5 top runners having a crack at each other. But that was never the idea with Giants Cup, and that was never the kind of the angle we wanted to pursue. And after those first few years of having a comp entry or offering a discounted entry to an elite and that sort of thing, we figured, okay, we've shown what we can do. And also, by that stage, UTD was coming along, and that was the platform for that. So, yeah, probably for the last 6, 7 years, we've had no elite runners. But what's quite nice is you get your 45-year-old strong runner. He actually gets out and can win the whole thing. So where he or she would never come close to that in a normal race, It's quite a nice, you still have that little element of competitiveness. It's just a little bit diluted, but I think it's quite fun for those guys. Yeah.
And then leading into UTD, take me back to the beginning of that. How did that vision start? Where was the dream? Where did that all come from?
So we'd had 3 years of Giants Cup, and obviously the trail scene in South Africa was really starting to explode. And it was clear that while Giants Cup had its niche and we were doing with Giants Cup exactly what we wanted to achieve, there was just so much more that could be done. Not just in terms of distances and events, but also the World Heritage Sites in which we lived there. It was basically untouched in terms of its potential. So it was always lurking that we needed to look at more competitive and more traditional type full-on trail runs, trail races. And then obviously I was in contact with people like Stu McConaughey from UTCT. A good friend of mine, Lance Wynn, was quite involved in the whole trail run environment. He had been for many years, and Stu and Lance were like, you've got to do something up here. It's just the logical next step. So I started looking carefully at routes and trails and what was out there. There was a lot of opportunity, but there was also very big limits as to what we could do. And the reason for that is the World Heritage Site is divided into different levels of, how can I say, different pristine levels. And most of it is what they qualify as pristine, which means you cannot have any event in there whatsoever. Even if they're existing trails, all that sort of, you cannot have an event. The only thing that you're allowed to have in there is a hiking party up to 12 in number. So that immediately, if you look at those Esenvelo maps, you get those maps that you can get at any one of the hiking centers, huts, and you'll see there different shades of normally green, but sometimes brown as well, on the areas of the World Heritage Site. And those are your different levels of how they've graded the sort of the pristine level of the environment. And obviously, as you get closer to the berg and move more deeply into the park, it gets more and more pristine. Huge opportunities with regard to a bigger event like UTD. It was really difficult in that I had to find routes that stayed in the areas where we were allowed to go. So it was quite frustrating because you'd have a magnificent route and then suddenly it would get to an area that's pristine and you can't get around it. And it just nullifies the entire route up till there. So you've had decades of what you think is unbelievable trail, and then suddenly it enters pristine levels, and now you can no longer continue. So you've got to disregard that whole section and find another way with a map, just looking at trail, because that's the other thing. Obviously, you cannot establish any new trails. You can only use existing hiking trails that have been built by Esenvelo. So those were built, as I say, in the sort of 60s and 70s. And there's big ones, well-known ones like the Giants Cup, but then there's lots of smaller ones all over the place. And the key was to link them, find ways to link them together and make sure that they were in an area of the park that we were allowed to actually stage an event. So that was the big challenge just from a practical point of view. But as I say, a fun one, because it meant spending days and weeks in the mountains looking for trail, seeing what we could find. Eventually we were able to put some options together to have a 100K race. The 62K race was easy. That was the Giants Cup non-stop. That one was probably the easiest one of all. And then the 100K was the more challenging route to find what we needed. And then the 62, and then the 32 we offered as half of the Giants Cup. So that was also pretty easy to do in terms of finding the trail. We just made it into an afternoon. We call it the Sundowner Run, and we started at 1:00 in the afternoon, which was a fun experience for most of the runners who would then finish in the dark and at least taste what it was like to spend that last hour or two in the dark, which would prepare them for future longer runs where they are going through the night. So that was a nice option. And then our shorter option, we found a really beautiful trail around Sani Pass Hotel. That was the 21K. And that was also a brand new trail, which I was able to find and reestablish. It had almost been abandoned, but it was still there. It took me a bit of effort to find it all, but we did find it and we reestablished it. Yeah, that ended up becoming the 21K course. So that was the framework for UTD. And we then had to go through all the hoops like for Giants Cup and approach Esenvelo with the proposal, numbers, donations to them via entry fees and the whole thing. I think our track record with Giants Cup served us well, in that they'd seen what we were doing, they'd seen we were serious about what we were doing, and that the environment was a very important part of the races. We just translated that into UTD, and that's where it all began.
Sure. And what was that first UTD like?
That was cool. It was a learning curve for us. It showed us we had something, for sure. Obviously, there was a lot we had to learn, and we made mistakes, but as they say, no one died, and everybody was fine, a good time out, and we learned a huge amount. But I think the most important thing that we learned was that we really had something special here. We just had to get it right. That's been the great thing about living where we do, is the one thing that I've never doubted is our product in terms of the trail and the offering and the environment and the southern Drakensberg and the Highberg and all of that. That's just, it's world class. So that's always been the bedrock of UTD and Giants Cup, is that if we get all the other stuff right, the trails will speak for themselves. And I think after the first year of UTD, that's the strongest thing we took away, is that so many people came to us and said, oh, you could do that differently, or you could do that differently, but you've got something here. And that was great. We knew we were on the right track. We just had to refine it and keep. Every year was very much a focus on how do we get better? How do we get bigger? Never rest on your laurels. Reinvest everything from the previous year and more, and just grow it and make it better. And I think that's the right attitude to take into an event like that. And it served us well.
And where did the Lesotho, that section, that whole experience, when did that enter the framework, and what was the thinking there, and how challenging was that?
That was the 100-miler. And the 100-miler was the logical next step after the first year. It was like, we've got 4 distances here, peaking with 100K, but at that stage, Addo had just come back onto the scene after a few years of being in the wilderness, Addo Miler, and we knew there was nothing like it on offering in South Africa and even in Africa, to have a 100-miler in the High Drakensberg and up in Lesotho. And that was also a logical area to find the distance. We needed clearly another 60Ks minimum. Even if we just tacked that onto the 100K, we needed at least 60. But if we changed the course away from the 100K, potentially we needed even more mileage. So what I did is I just worked backwards and saw what we had in South Africa if we came out of Lesotho. And once again, we were limited as to where we could exit from Lesotho. It's pristine wilderness.
Sure.
So we could never exit Lesotho anywhere except down Sani Pass. So in some ways that was confining, in that we had to give up on all those other things that people wanted us to do. But in other ways, it was quite liberating in that there was no other choice. That's the only place we could come out of Lesotho. And it also gave us an easy answer to give to people going, why don't you go there? Why don't you go here? It was like, so once I worked that out and knew that we had to come out, then I knew pretty much how much mileage I needed in Lesotho, which was about 75 Ks. And once I knew I needed 75 Ks, we kind of thought, well, we want to start at Sani Top, and we have to come out of Lesotho at Sani Top. It's going to have to be some kind of big loop within Lesotho. The logical thing that immediately grasped my attention was the highest peak in southern Africa, south of Kilimanjaro, is Tabana Hlanyana, and that was within range. We could get there and still get our 75 Ks. So then I started thinking and building course in my head with maps, and then obviously going up with a lot of recce's and just constantly doing recce's, going, okay, if we go here and we want to incorporate Tabana and we got to get back to Sani Top, how do we do it? And I just went round and round until eventually refined a course that gave me, it ended up being 72 Ks, which was what we needed, and incorporated Tabana and ticked all the boxes that we were looking for. Then obviously we had to approach all the Lesotho authorities, right from Mahotlong Mounted Police to Lesotho Tourism to the local shepherds, the local chiefs. Really had to get everybody on board. And once we'd got all those permissions, then we could launch, which is what we did. And that became the mile, which we then added to the other 4 distances. So that was how we got to Lesotho. And that gave us a very unique angle then, because obviously we had the altitude, we had the uniqueness of Sani Pass and Tabana Tlanyan and all that kind of stuff. And then we had traversing two countries in one race, running through a border post in the middle of the night, things like that, which were all very cool elements to bring to the table. So yeah, it was an exciting time.
And what have been the biggest developments over the years since you started?
Obviously, the focus in the beginning, once we got the miler launched and we knew we had those 5 distances and a sustainable kind of model, it was all about just adding quality, adding numbers in terms of runners, and just raising the profile of the event. That was the huge focus, to make sure that we tried to stand head and shoulders in the trail running community. So we wanted to be something that every runner at some stage knew they had to come and take part, whether it was the 21 or the miler, or even building. We've got runners who've done all 5, which is wonderful. So it was about building profile and building numbers, getting more elite athletes, making sure that the sharp end of our fields represented the best, if at least in South Africa. Internationals was always a challenge for us, because not the race itself, but KZN, Underberg, isolated areas. It's a much harder sell to the European markets or whoever else it might be. So we didn't look too hard at internationals, but we looked really hard at the local community, making sure we had the best of the best in the local community. And I think we did that. And we had some really high quality races at the sharp end, and then obviously made sure we offered a really quality product on to the rest of the field.
Yeah.
And that went really well. And then obviously COVID came along. 2019 had been a really successful event for us, and 2020 our numbers were through the roof, and and we had some high profile runners coming, and we had to pull the plug on the race 3 weeks before race day. So that was a big challenge at the time. What we did is we just rolled over every entry to the next year. So we weren't at that stage, couldn't refund people, because obviously we'd already spent so much on the event itself, only being only 3 weeks out. So all we could do was just say to everyone, you got a free rollover to next year or the following year or the following year. So we just said, if you can't come back next year, you'll roll over. We'll stay in place for at least another 3 years. And we just had to tighten our belts and get through it. And in many ways, it was obviously quite a big step back, but it rebounded significantly, because 2021, the following year, was, I think, a breakthrough year for UTD. We had a good base of people who were coming back right from opening of entries. And then we had a whole another 6 months to try and sell the race to new people. We had a whole bunch of people who'd been stuck in their houses for 9 months or whatever it is. So people were really looking to get out. So 2021 was a great bounce back event for us. And I think on the back of that, Stu from UTCT and I had obviously been chatting for years, but I think on the back of that, the guys at UTCT saw the value of UTD and started expressing interest in potentially partnering up. And when you ask about what were the biggest developments for UTD, I'd say it was that COVID year where potentially things could have gone completely upside down, to the way we were able to rebound in 2021, and then off the back of that end up in a partnership with Summit Events and Ultra Trail Cape, which has obviously taken UTD to a whole nother level. We've got, as of a couple of months ago, we've got Rand Merchant Bank now on as a title sponsor. It's just what Stu and his team and Summit have been able to bring to the party is all the things that I could never do and was always totally useless at, which was like finding sponsors and getting out there and doing this kind of thing too. The big thing now is obviously the partnership, what they can bring to the table. It dovetails so well, because we're in April, they're in November, they're in the Cape, we're in the Drakensberg. So it's 2 totally different offerings, but you can bring all the strengths of the race organizing team to both. Obviously, I'm not involved in UTCT, but they can bring all their strengths to UTD, which they have been doing. And yeah, I'm really optimistic for the future.
You've grown with the sport in South Africa. How do you see UTD's role in that growth, contributing to it, but also it's grown and you've grown? Like, how does that partnership or relationship work? Do you see it as a catalyst, or the trail community in South Africa grew and you benefited from that?
So I've always had a very strong mindset that you can't grow at the expense of other events or other trail organizers. You might get short-term gains, but in the long term, you're not going to succeed. So my attitude has always been that the more successful events in South Africa are, the better it is for UTD, because the community is growing. We are bringing new people into the sport. And if a whole bunch of people go to one event one year, potentially they're going to come to UTD the next year, and vice versa. So I think growing the trail community is a vital thing, and something that obviously UTD can do, because it offers a nice spectrum from the miler all the way down to what is now the 25, not the 21. So it offers a nice spectrum for people getting into the sport or people looking for new challenges. But then what it also does is hopefully grow the base of trail runners who then go out and go to other events around the country, and maybe in a few years come back to UTD. And in the same way, those other events around the country are growing new talents and growing new support, and those people are going to come to UTD. So I think it's vital in South Africa. We're not a big enough market to just go your own way and do your own thing. I think it really is a community that needs to work together, and that's been my experience with other race directors. I like to think I've got a really good relationship with all the race directors in South Africa. We don't necessarily see things the same way. We might have different goals. We're clearly different people. But I think if we're all just doing our own thing in our own space and creating quality events, then that's to the benefit of all. And that has to be, in my opinion, the long-term and successful mindset of any race director in this country. You're not just growing your race, you're growing the sport, and that will inevitably end up benefiting you.
Yeah. And going over to Sani Stagger, what was it before? What was the appeal, and how did you get involved?
So Sani Stagger was a road run up and down Sani Pass, or just down Sani Pass, that has been going since the mid-90s, so 25 years, just nearly 30 years. So it was started by the local community as a sort of fundraiser for, I think, the Moth guys, the memorable Orderton hats, veterans, and different things like that. And then it just grew, and it was organized by the local running club, the Sani Athletic Club, for many years. And yeah, as a description, it's a full marathon up and down Sani Pass, so 21 up, 21 down, or it's a half marathon, 21 down, based at Premier Resort Sani Pass Hotel. And yeah, obviously a super challenging marathon, starting at sort of 1,500 meters and peaking out at just under 3,000 meters. And then obviously a brutal descent all the way back down. But South Africans being South Africans, that just sounded like great fun. It was successful. Yeah, it was a successful event pretty much from the first couple of years. It had a very dedicated following, very passionate following of runners. And a half marathon is also a unique half marathon in that every runner gets ferried to the top in either Lesotho taxi or local tour group operators who help us. So every runner gets a drive up Sani Pass to the start, which is quite a unique experience. And then they get to bomb all the way down to the finish, which is sounds easy, but I can promise you is brutal. You'll see a lot of people walking around the next day who are not walking so well. Normally the guys who've done the half marathon, because the people who do the marathon tend to have warmed up well and are much more conservative on the way back down. Whereas the half marathon guys start fresh and cold at the top, and they just come down like a bat out of hell and then wonder why they can't walk the next day. But it's a very cool and unique race. The Sani Pass itself is obviously an incredible environment and a unique pass in South Africa and in Africa, very well known internationally as well. But yeah, it was being organized by the running club, the Sani Athletic Club, for many years. And in 2015, they came to me, and they had a sponsor at the time who they'd lost, and they were just struggling to make ends meet with the event, and they were quite concerned as a club. Obviously, they were in no position to run an event at a loss. Like, where does the financial responsibility end? So they'd had some money in the kitty from previous years, so that they knew they could keep putting it on at a loss for a year or two, but they were quite worried as to what would happen if they didn't get another sponsor and the kitty started to run a bit dry. So they came to me and said, look, would I be interested, Running Man Adventures, be interested in potentially taking it over? So we had a good look at it, and yeah, financially, the guys have been doing a great job. It was just a matter of there just wasn't enough money in in the event, purely from an income and expenditure perspective. We looked at it very carefully and thought we can take it on, but we're going to have to make it grow. We're going to have to change a few things, and we're going to have to potentially add some other distances or some other race to it just to try and build more numbers and make it more viable. So we took it on, and in the first 2 years, we just kept it as it was because we wanted to learn about the event without making a whole lot of changes. So all we did was try and just grow numbers, but keep the traditional marathon and the traditional down run. And that's what we did. And we managed to stabilize it to the point where it wasn't losing money, but it certainly wasn't making any money. And then in the third year, we added what is known as the staggered trail. So we were able to add 2 trail runs to the events as well. And you've already got a strong brand in Sani Stagger. Now you just got to try and get trail runners to come to that brand. So you're not starting from scratch. You do have an audience, which makes a big difference. And you're looking potentially for road runners who are willing to make the changeover, or you're just looking for trail runners who are coming into an existing brand. So we went through the whole Esmvelo thing again, had a 21K route and a 38K route proposed, which we were able to get approved by Esmvelo. And we added staggered trail in the third year. So I think that's either 2017 or 2018. I can't quite remember. And it was limited, staggered trail was limited to 300 runners across the board. So whether it was 200 in the 21 and 100 in the 38, or whatever the split may be. And it was very successful right off the blocks. It sold out in that first, the 300 trail runners. And it's been a great addition to Sani Stagger ever since. So that's helped to add the viability to the run because we've now got another 300 runners coming through. It's raised the profile and the offering. Obviously, it's a more diverse offering. And over the past 3 or 4 years, we've managed to keep growing the marathon size and the half marathon size on the road. And then the trail run is limited to 300, but we're in a situation now where the 21K down run on the road sells out in about half an hour. And that's 450 runners. So it's a hugely sought after event. The trail run sells out in about 3 or 4 days. And then the marathon, we never sell the marathon out, but we always push it as much as we can. So this year we had just under 400 runners. So overall, we're sitting at about 1,150 runners across the trail and the road. So the Sani Pass Hotel is obviously the race space, and we book out the hotel, and the runners that are then have an opportunity to book at the hotel via an entry platform. So we do it through an entry platform. So it's all very well organized and has the capacity to take the demand, because the hotel, I think this year sold out in about 25 minutes as well. So there's a huge demand, those 100 rooms at the hotel. So it's important that there's a platform that can actually handle that demand, which is why we take it on board ourselves, because the hotel themselves just don't have the capacity to take that kind of 150 people on the telephone shouting at them trying to book a room. Yeah. So we set the whole thing up via a service provider of ours called Runcation, and they have a whole setup on the entry platform where people can then book their accommodation. So yeah, so that's Sani Stagger, a very popular event, but still we desperately liable event financially and to add more value to the race itself, because the numbers are great, but yeah, it is a more challenging event to run financially.
And what are some of the logistical challenges you have faced and you do face across your events, especially now that they're all like established? What are the big ticket items in terms of logistics?
Safety, number one. So safety is always huge. UTD, people running through the night in the middle of Lesotho at 3,500 meters with snow on the ground, things like that. So safety has always been a huge challenge logistically in terms of having safety in place, having support available to get to remote areas, things like that. The other distances at UTD, the 100K, the 62, all the trails are remote. If someone breaks a leg or has a cardiac event or something like that, it's not always easy to get to them quickly. So that's always it weighs heavily on you in that you might end up in a situation where you're going to struggle to get to someone timeously. So it is a big responsibility. It's always a huge relief for me at UTD when the miler guys come out of Lesotho. It's okay, I can draw a line under that part of the race and it does feel like a little bit of weight is lifted. Then logistically, races like Sani Stega. This year we transported 420 people up the Sani Pass to the start of the half marathon. So logistically, that's a whole heap of Lesotho taxi, 4x4 taxis, which are coming from Mokhotlong. I've got to book those taxis, and then I've got to make sure that they're actually there and they arrive, which is super stressful, because when you've got 400 runners standing on the side of the road and no taxis, you can start to sweat a bit. So things like that are challenging. Aid stations on the Sani Pass for Sani Stega. So we have 10 aid stations up the Sani Pass. So all of those guys have got to get into place up on the Sani Pass. And above the SA border post, you need 4-wheel drive. So that's very challenging logistically. And then making sure that your medical support is available in a widespread manner so that hopefully you can get to injured runners as quickly as possible. Look, we do mitigate some of that in UTD in particular with companies like Sport Tracks, Mike de Haast from Skyrun. They've obviously got their tracking company. So we put trackers on all the runners that are in the more extreme environments. So like the 100-miler runners and the 100K runners at UTD. But yeah, there are always challenges. And look, we changed UTD significantly in 2021, where we moved the race base finish to Sani Pass Hotel, so that we were no longer going from point to point. Everybody was coming to the finish line at Sani Pass Hotel, so that helped us a great deal in not having to run around the countryside, putting up start lines, taking down start lines, doing things like that. So we've come to realize that it's important to do stuff like that, because if you, as the organizer, are stretched, you're going to run into problems when you're trying to then serve the runners. So you need to make sure that you actually simplify things on the back end so that the service you can provide on the front end is actually viable. There's no point in having a race organizing team who's exhausted and sleep deprived and can't do their job properly. And it might seem heroic in the early days of not sleeping for 3 days while you put on a race, but it actually is a disservice to the runners after a day and a half when you can't keep your eyes open and you're making bad decisions because you're exhausted. So you've actually got to be smart about these things.
Sure. And do you have any moments that stick out as particularly memorable that encapsulates why you do this, or kind of moments that happen at every event that you're like, wow, this is why I love this job?
Yeah, it's hard to necessarily pick out one or two particular ones looking back, but at every event, there are always moments that you go, okay, so this is why I'm doing it, because you definitely ask yourself very often, why am I doing this? So at every event, it's normally people-based, I would say. It's normally that person who comes up to you and tells you they've had the best run of their lives, or they've had some kind of memorable experience. I'd say that's the most meaningful thing that happens. And whenever that happens, it's a really cool thing, because invariably you're going to also have criticism. And it's human nature you remember the one critic and you forget about the 20 people who gave you a compliment. So you have to make a concerted effort not to let the negative outweigh the positive. Whether the criticism was valid or not, it can weigh you down if you allow it to. So those moments where people come up to you at the race are huge. They really make it all worthwhile. It might be a sunset or a sunrise, or it could be seeing headlights, looking up in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning and seeing headlights going on a ridgeline, and knowing that they're on a trail that you discovered and resurrected, and that they're now running down that trail 2 in the morning. Essentially, they're in your hands. The only reason they're there is because you decided to put this race on and you found that trail, and now they've bought into your idea and they've come along. I think that's probably the most meaningful stuff that happens. So it's not necessarily an individual. It could just be a moment like that. But those are the ones you have to hang on, because you need those to make it all worthwhile.
As your events grow, how do you maintain that personal touch, or that feeling that you are still involved, even though now it's like a massive logistical operation?
That's a very important point, because you can lose the wood for the trees when an event gets really big and it's just so hectic and so much pressure that you battle to have those personal moments or those personal touches. They might be in there, but you might not necessarily have the ability to appreciate them. And I think it's very important to try and hold on to those and to make sure, look, that's why events like smaller events like the Giants Cup and that's how you can remain grounded in many ways. So like something like UTD or Sani Stagger can become so big that it's just like this rolling sort of freight train that you almost feel as much of a passenger in many ways as the runners do sometimes. But smaller events like Giants Cup and then also the conservation fundraiser we do, Rhino Peak Challenge, smaller ones like that really do enable you to focus on the soft touches, those little things that like a Giants Cup, every year we have 2 surprise secret aid stations where we get some mates with backpacks to hike up with little bottles of champagne and special little snacks.
No, amazing.
They just find a little cool place on the trail and surprise people. And we end up with, that's the nature of Giants Cup. We get some people who end up staying at the place where eventually the guys have to kick them out because they've had 3 or 4 beers and they're like, it's time to leave now. You need to get finished. Yeah, and it's a very important part of it.
Yeah. And how do you balance it all with your personal life, wife and kids? I believe they do get involved in events. So is that if you want to see me, you have to get involved in events? Or do you have a way of balancing that?
Yeah, my wife Catherine does get very involved and she's a huge help. The kids blow hot and cold. Sometimes they're keen to help, sometimes they don't know, and they run a mile. So it depends where they are at the time. And look, things we're getting before the partnership with Summit and UTCT, things were getting a little bit out of hand because essentially I was running all of that stuff completely on my own. UTD in particular was extremely demanding for a long period of time, not just a month or 6 weeks around race day. You know, that UTD from 4 months out was full on. So that was becoming unsustainable. I was getting the feeling that eventually I was going to start dropping the ball with regard to the need to grow the event every year, be bigger and better than the previous year. Partnering with the Summit guys couldn't have come at a better time in that regard because they just brought obviously energy, logistical manpower and ideas and all positive things to the table. And I was able to step back quite a bit on UTD and focus on the parts of UTD that are really close to me. So like the trail itself, Esenvelo, the local landowners, those relationships, and then the other guys can focus on their strengths. So that has taken the temperature out the room a bit with regard to where we were going from a family and time and everything else perspective. So yeah, things are in a much better space in that regard. So yeah, there was a time there where farm, family and events were, yeah, it was getting quite hectic, but it's better, in a better place now, which is great.
And what does the future hold across the board in terms of the events, in terms of new events coming, any new developments?
So in the beginning, I was of the mindset every time a new idea or new opportunity presented itself, it was like, oh, we got to run with that. We got to explore that or do it. And I think that a lot of event organizers go through that where they see opportunity wherever they look, but that can be a mistake. And I think what often happens is you see guys do that and they expand into quite a big bouquet of events. And then a few years later, they've actually pulled back slightly and they focused on their core events and maybe culled a few of the ones that probably they shouldn't have got into in the first place. Currently, I'm certainly not looking to start anything new. I would rather just take what we are currently doing and really try and make sure that they are as good as they possibly can be, focus on that every year. And that doesn't mean necessarily growing numbers. It can just be growing the quality or doing things slightly differently. But that's where I'd like to keep focusing my energy now, is on just making the existing events as good as possible. I still love my triathlon in terms of the multi-discipline side of it. I'd love to put on a really high quality Xterra type triathlon, not a road triathlon. Underberg is really well suited to that. We've got some beautiful big still water lakes. We've got obviously great trails for mountain biking and running. So maybe one day I might look at something like that, but not right now. Yeah. At the moment, just focus on what's in.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. I feel we've only touched the surface and it's been amazing. So yeah, really looking forward to hopefully getting out to two of your events next year. But thanks for making the time.
Absolutely, Dean. And thanks for being so patient with me. Please let us know if you want to get to any of our events. We'd love to have you.
Amazing. Thank you. Cheers.
Feeling fired up after this incredible episode? Dive deeper into the world of trail running by exploring our other episodes, available wherever you get your podcasts. We're eagerly awaiting your feedback as well, so connect with us on Instagram at TrailChasersPod. Don't hold back. Like, comment, message, and share your thoughts. Until next week, keep chasing those trails.